Für Zoom, ja. Für Zoom haben es. Ja. Ja, das reicht aber auch, ja. Ja. Na, genau, genau. Okay, gut. Dann gehen wir davon aus, dass das mit dem Mikro funktioniert. Vielleicht.
Web, oder?
Nee, und meine Assistentin sagen, wenn das Stream live ist. Das
Okay.
heißt,
Hallo? Hört man mich? Schönen guten Morgen. Nichts?
10 Zuschauer. Ich habe jetzt 40. Haben Sie noch einen anderen Link gemacht? Den Sie mir geschickt haben. Das ist eine Prüfungssituation, Herr Hübing. Das ist Ihnen schon bewusst, ne? Das ist eine Prüfungssituation. Das endet mit 9N. O0N.
Hört man mich, ja? Jetzt. Ja, einen schönen guten Morgen, geschätzte Damen und Herren. Ich freue mich, zum Habil-Vortrag vom Professor Dr. Tobias Eule zu begrüßen. Es handelt sich um den öffentlichen Vortrag für eine Habilitationsleistung, die von der Rechtswissenschaftlichen und Wirtschaftswissenschaftlichen Fakultät der Universität Bern vergeben wird. Ich darf Ihnen ganz kurz die Struktur des Vortrages präsentieren oder der Veranstaltung. Es wird jetzt ein Vortrag stattfinden im Ausmaß von 40 Minuten. Sie haben sich auf YouTube eingeloggt. Nach dem Vortrag bitte ich Sie dann zu switchen auf Zoom, weil da geht es dann um die Q&As, also die Fragen, die Sie möglicherweise stellen und die Antworten, die damit verbunden sind. Und dann gibt es einen weiteren Login für jene, die Mitglied der Kommission sind, um über die Leistung von Herrn Eule befinden zu können. Ich darf jetzt in der Folge den Herrn Eule vorstellen und dann wird er den Vortrag eben halten zum Titel Law as a Profession. Er will Revisiting Sociological Approaches to the Legal Profession. Das ist das Thema seines Vortrages. Der Vortrag wird auf Englisch stattfinden, deshalb stelle ich Herrn Eule jetzt auch auf Englisch vor. So Tobias Eule holds degrees in sociology from the London School of Economics and the University of Cambridge. His PhD on the implementation of immigration law in Germany received the Toby Jackman Prize for the most outstanding PhD from the University of Cambridge. He specializes on sociological approaches to migration and inequality, and he is co-author of several books and papers, among others, Inside Immigration Law and Migrants Before the Law. He co-edited special issues for the Journal of Ethnic and Migration Studies, Qualitative Studies, and Journal of Organizational Ethnography, which is obviously a forthcoming work. He is also associate editor of Civic Sociology. He has previously held positions at the Institute of Sociology at the University of Bern, the Department of Anthropology, London School of Economics, and he was a visiting fellow at the Center for Socio-Legal Studies at the University of Oxford. Since 2019, he has been heading a joint research group on sociology of law, a collaboration between the Faculty of Law and the Hamburg Institute of Social Research. So I do welcome Professor Eule, and he will start with his presentation. Please keep in mind that after his presentation that we need to change to Zoom, and the presentation will be 40 minutes, so the floor is open to you, and thank you for presenting.
Right. Welcome all, and thank you for listening and watching this rather special type of presentation. Apologies also for the technical difficulties. I hope everyone has now found the correct link. I want to talk to you today about law as a profession. Specifically, I want to talk about what sociological insights into the legal profession might offer to the debate around the legal profession. It is a presentation for two faculties, but of course, since I'm talking about the legal profession, this might be a bit more interesting for the law faculty than the economics and social science faculty. I apologize in advance if that is the case. I want to focus today on two main topics. The first topic is looking at empirical insights into the legal profession, with a specific focus on recent statistics on graduate careers of legal professionals in Switzerland. The second topic I want to look at are sociological approaches to legal practice. This is a more theoretical part that looks at both classical theoretical approaches to legal practice, particularly legal doctrine from authors like Weber, Luhmann, or Bourdieu, but also current sociological and social scientific research into this field. First, a short warning though. There is much more to be said about the current state of the legal profession from a sociological perspective than fits into 40 minutes. As a result, I will have to shorten certain types or leave out certain areas of this field of research. We will not talk, unfortunately, about self-representations of law or representations of law in the media. We'll also not talk about law in action, which is my specific focus of research in my empirical work. At the same time, there is a relative dearth of data. So for some areas of research, particularly relating to Switzerland, we simply don't know enough or don't know enough yet to provide meaningful data. For that reason, we will not talk about things like the social background of legal professionals with regards to Switzerland, because there's simply not enough good data. So I start with the empirical insights into the legal profession. And we can make a few general, or I'll make a few general notes, look at a couple of recent trends in the legal profession, and then look at career development, career statistics on Switzerland specifically. So we can say that legal services is both a healthy and a growing sector of the services industry, but that it's also changing. So it's healthy, it's in good shape, but it's also changing. And the way that people have thought about the change is that the legal profession is changing from guild to business. And we look in how far this also applies to Switzerland. So what you see here is the size of the legal services market worldwide in US billion dollars from 2013 to 2021, obviously with 2020 and 21 and 19 being estimations. You see a continuous growth. We have an annual adjusted growth rate of about 4%. This is, of course, a pre-corona estimate. We don't know what's happening afterwards. This is driven largely by the radical growth of the legal services sector in the United States. That's both the sector that has the biggest share of legal services worldwide, followed by Europe, but also the biggest growth rates. Legal services worldwide is now contributing to the world economy at a bigger share than Switzerland, at a share comparable to perhaps to Mexico. So it's healthy, but it's also changing. And I want to briefly look at 4 key global trends that those of you that are of the legal profession will surely know. We look at specialization, we look at internationalization, we look at the digitalization, and external and internal competition. Specialization refers to the fact that we see some tendencies towards the standardization of mass contracts. But in general, and much more importantly, we see an increasing complexity and differentiation of society that requires a more complex and more simply legislation. That in turn leads to a stronger specialization of legal practitioners. We talk in the last 40 years about a shift from generalists to specialists that specialize in specific areas of the law. When we're talking about internationalization, and of course these different factors are interrelated, and we might discuss later how each shapes each other. With regards to internationalization, we see an increase in international agreements and treaties, so there's more international legal documents, international legislation. We also see a relative approximation of national legal systems, not an absolute parallel development, but a relative approximation in areas like trademark law, patent law, air traffic law, and TRIPS, so trade-related international property laws. We see on a regional level a unification of the administration of justice through 2 main themes: minimum standards and the review by supranational courts, and Europe, of course, is the main example here. For the legal profession, that means that particularly in business law and public international law decrees become more and more popular. Even if they don't replace the national qualification for lawyers, the national bar exams, these degrees in international law that take into account this internationalization become more and more popular. The next theme is digitalization, something that we're all very familiar with in this very moment. Digitalization creates both challenges and opportunities. Challenges because the digitalization of social and business life creates new areas that need to be regulated or that create potential conflicts. We have multi-sided markets, for example, we have platform economies, and we have issues with social media. Digitalization also refers to the rise of artificial intelligence and machine learning. Digitalization also provides opportunities, though, through the digitalization of legal services, through the provision of online legal aid, for example, but also through digital legal services. And perhaps the most prevalent example of this is the fact that in the UK, since 2018, you can now apply for a divorce online and go through the complete divorce proceedings online without ever having to enter a courtroom. You can even have a Zoom meeting with the divorce judge if necessary. This also doesn't require a lawyer. The fourth key trend is the increase of external and internal competition. External competition referring to the increasing complexity and overlap of law with other specialized areas. We see that particularly in the area of tax, where specialists from finance, from tax accounting, from law, all compete for similar jobs and contracts. We also see an increased internal competition within the legal profession because we have a rising number of graduates, we have greater freedom of movement internationally but also nationally, and we have individual compensation arrangements, which means the market is much more competitive, and we have now in almost all countries the right to advertise for legal services. So these are the mainstream key four global trends. I'd argue, though, that there's a fifth one that is particularly relevant to the situation in Switzerland at the moment, and something where I'll say we need a lot more research to have an informed debate about how the legal profession is changing. And that is changing professional trajectories. In conceptual terms, people talk about the Americanization of the legal profession, where the legal profession goes from judicial body to service provider, from a professional field in which there is less court activity and more provision of general advice, of contract drafting, or of out-of-court dispute resolution. And this is related in America classically to a rise in income from legal services, and at the same time with a drastic drop in court cases, specifically civil litigation cases. This is something that is mirrored now also in Germany and Austria, and I'll show you some data here. So the light gray area is the civil cases, the decline of civil cases in the US since the 1960s. The dark black dot here is first instance civil cases in the lowest civil court in Germany that have declined almost 50%, around 48% over the last 10 years. There's a relatively stagnant trend on second level courts. And in Austria, we see a stark decline both in first and second instance civil courts, with the exception of social welfare claims, which are categorized as civil court cases here. So what about Switzerland? Switzerland does not see a drop in civil cases like that. And some argue this is because Switzerland reformed its new civil procedure code, and that has led to a stabilization of cases rather than a decline. However, we see an interesting development when it comes to career data, which might refer to this shift from judicial body to service provider. So I want to look now at some specific statistics that talk about the entry into the career, into the professional field. That is based on the Federal Office of Statistics survey of graduates. So this is about reported income mostly. Compared to other university graduates, according to the Federal Office of Statistics, law graduates have an above average starting wage at least 5 years into their career. So at the end point, at their early career phase, they have above average wages. They have an above average salary increase. They have an average gender pay gap. And below average unemployment rate. So it's a relatively attractive career option, let's say. What we see here is the change in law graduates, so with a licentiate, with a diploma, or with a master's degree, and people who successfully take and pass the bar exam. This is the number of law graduates, which has risen significantly since the 1990s to now approaching almost 2,000 graduates annually. And you see here the number of people who take the bar exam, which has also risen, but not as steeply. In fact, if you compare the two numbers, you see that there's a declining trend, certainly from the 1990s, from where over 70% took the bar exam after graduation to now around 50%. You can say it's difficult to compare annual statistics with annual statistics, so I've added a lag here, an average that takes 3 years from graduation to passing the bar. So if you add that into the calculation, the development is even more pronounced. Or the trend, we don't really have significant data enough to do a full analysis of that. But there seems to be a decline in graduates who then go on to pass the bar. Which is interesting because we see a similar trend when we look at the bar exams compared to bar registrations. So here again we have the law graduates overall. This is the number of people who take the bar exam, and this is the number of people who then register for a bar license. So who use that they graduated from the bar exam and then registered as lawyers. And I've used a proxy here, which is the registration with the Federal Swiss Lawyers Association, which collates data from all of the cantonal lawyers association. We have now a registry of lawyers in Switzerland, and the numbers are almost identical. The difference is less than 100, so it's quite a good proxy, and we have good historical data on that. What you see here, if you compare the two dark blue or darker bluish columns, that there seems to be a declining trend in the rate of lawyers who register as lawyers. So whereas in the early 2000s, and we can go back, and it's even more true for the 1990s, close to 90% of people who pass the bar also register as lawyers. Now the number seems to be approaching 78, 75%. So that raises a number of questions. One of the possible explanations for the fact that less graduates take the bar is that the income expectations for the first 5 years of law graduates is lower than of any other field. Why is that? Because law graduates that want to pass the bar have to do internships, which on average are paid very, very low. This has an interesting effect if we compare law graduates with a master's degree with law graduates that finish their education after their bachelor's degree, which is a very new development. Light blue is people who pass the bachelor's degree, black people who passed and entered the labor market with a master's degree. You see that both in terms of the median reported income and of the highest quartile, we see much higher reported income for bachelor graduates than for master graduates. So while it is perhaps a new phenomenon, it might be for some a very lucrative career option to finish their law studies with a bachelor's degree. Which leads me to a couple of questions about this diversifying field, about these different trajectories. And I'm focusing here that we need further research, and this is just indicative data. The first question is, what are the at least short-term benefits of a Bachelor of Law career where you finish your studies after the bachelor? If you have high potential earnings, at least in the short run, if you don't have the salary sag in the first couple of years? What are the career options? Where do people go? Do they return into kind of a more classic examination with taking the master's later and then the bar exam, or do they continue on this career trajectory? The second big question is, what do Masters of Law graduates do that increasingly don't go for the bar? And the third is, related to that is the question of which law graduates actually don't go for the bar, and what is the impact of the decreased short-term earning through having to go through an internship? So does that affect everyone, or is it kind of a social sorting mechanism to take this route? The third question is, why do bar graduates increasingly do not register for practice? And related to that, then the question, what is actually the added value of a bar exam in terms of expected income, but also in terms of things like social prestige and social capital? I'll leave the empirical part here and now look at the specifics of legal practice, which is the second and final part of my presentation. What is specific to legal practice from a sociological perspective? In summary, we can say three interrelated things. First, that through practices of judging and commenting, legal doctrine aspires to be objective and autonomous of external influences. There is a huge aspiration in the way legal practice as judging or as commenting works. Secondly, sociological scholars say this is necessary because legal norms require interpretation, because they're not precise enough and they require this type of interpretative work in judging and commenting. Thirdly, this legal practice of legal doctrine stabilizes both the state and the economy because it increases the predictability of social relations overall. We'll now look at some of the kind of spotlight type arguments from some of the classical legal theorists that have looked at that, and then look at more contemporary research in this field. What we see, interestingly, is that there's a kind of tentative agreement among key sociologists despite different theoretical approaches. And I'll look at three here: Max Weber, Nicholas Luhmann, and Pierre Bourdieu, who come from very different sociological tradition, but kind of argue quite similar things. So regarding the question, why do we need a specific legal practice, Max Weber has the most famous argument in his Economy and Society, where he says that the specific features of modern capitalism could arise only in such circumstances where the judge, as in the bureaucratic states with its rational law, is more or less an automaton of paragraphs. The legal documents, together with the costs and fees, are dropped in at the top with the expectation that the judgment will emerge at the bottom together with more or less sound arguments, an apparatus, that is, whose functioning is by and large calculable or predictable. So the key function of law from this perspective is that it makes conflicts predictable, that it makes the action of courts predictable, and that is important, Weber says, for the development of modern capitalism, of the modern economy. However, norms need to be interpreted, and that's something that is widely recognized, including by the Swiss Federal Court, who says in two different judgments that even if the content of a contractual term appears clear at first sight, it may result from other term of the contract for the aim pursued by the parties, or from other circumstances that the text of that term does not accurately convey the meaning of the agreement concluded, or the fact that a clause is relatively clear, textually clear, does not exclude a priori an interpretation. It has to be examined whether there is reason to believe that a clause should be understood in a manner other than its literal meaning. So context and the need for interpretation, even when things are clear at first sight, is something that the Federal Court stresses itself. Weber kind of picks up on that also in Economy and Society. He says that legal dogmatics aims at the correct meaning of propositions. Towards this end, the jurist examines each of them and tries to determine its logically correct meaning in such a way that all of them can be combined in a system which is logically coherent, that is, free from internal contradictions. This system is what he calls the legal order in the juridical sense of the word. Key here is that this ideal legal order, according to Weber, has nothing directly to do with the world of real economic contact. So it's an idealized version of human behavior, which people aim to clarify, but does not have anything to do necessarily with the fact how people behave in their social relations or economic relations. This is picked up by Luhmann in the 1970s, where he talks about the stabilization of expectations. From this perspective, legal doctrine limits the scope of arbitrary decisions, as it defines the conditions of the legally possible, and with that increases the reliability and reduces the arbitrariness of legal decisions. He calls it legitimation through formal procedure. This legal doctrine is governed by its own rules, so it's autopoietic in Luhmann's world, and this means that the system of law is autonomous because it abides by its own rules in order to stabilize itself and with that social relations. This is picked up again in a slightly different way, but agreeing with key terms by Pierre Bourdieu, who argues in The Force of Law that the juridical field is the site of a competition for monopoly of the right to determine the law. Within this field, there occurs a confrontation among actors processing a technical competence which is inevitably social and which consists essentially of the socially recognized capacity to interpret a corpus of text, sanctifying a correct or legitimized vision of the social world. This is essential to recognize, he says, in order to take account the relative autonomy of the law and the properly symbolic effect of this miscognition that results from the illusion of the law's absolute autonomy in relation to external pressures. So he says this is an ideal, as does Luhmann or Weber, and he says it's important to recognize. And it's important to recognize because the practice of producing legal doctrine for Bourdieu and many contemporary scholars is a social activity. So it is something that might strive to an ideal status, but is produced socially and in that by humans through human interaction. It is influenced then by rules that are social, not only legal. It is influenced by hierarchies and is influenced by conflicts. And scholars recently, particularly in the German-speaking world, have focused on the way people learn how to practice legal doctrine, how to write or think in legal doctrine terms. People say, for example, Friedrichshäuser, that it is a professional habitus that is formed, borrowing from Bourdieu, that is a synthesis of biographically acquired dispositions of student lifestyle and of an academic self-image. Others say that through studying law, there is an academic socialization taking place, which is happening through a series of cognitive and social exercises over the course of which there is kind of a mental change which takes place and gradually grinds people into new routines. And people argue that the fact that law education in specific nation states are so similar, that means that law graduates, even if they don't graduate from the same university, have a high level of social cohesion because they have similar expectations of how practice is done properly. Legal doctrine is learned at university, but it's also something that is inherently subjective. And this is something, of course, that is not necessarily a sociological contribution to the debate, but something that legal scholars also agree on. They agree that legal doctrine cannot escape the subjectivity of individual or collective reasoning, and this is something that has been debated again and again also in the Swiss legal profession. The question is, can we measure this? Can we measure this subjectivity of producing something that aims to be objective? And an important part of research here is done by the law and behavioral economics research, which, following authors like Jols and Sunstein, looks at the question, how rational or irrational are legal professionals really, and what kind of biases do they have, and potentially can they be overcome? So we see a number of studies that look at specific aspects of the legal profession and ask questions like, are arbitrators human? The authors have similar papers on the question, are judges human? Are lawyers human? Are law professors human? And of course, in all of these, they find out that, yes, they are human and that they are limited in their rational capacities. They are biased in what they do or susceptible to bias. And in fact, they are not more rational than other human beings with or without formal education. And I'm going to skip this, but if you were all here, we would test this. We would test your rationality by looking at some of the experiments that people do, but we'll skip that now. There are also other factors that influence the way that legal practice happens. For example, a famous study by Danziger et al. From about 10 years ago found out that judges tend to judge more harshly just before lunchtime. So hunger might have an influence on how a judgment is decided and argued. We also see that things like the social background of defendants and the imagined criminal capacity of defendants has an impact of sentencing. All of these things are particularly well researched in the US. What we also see are questions not only about judging, but also about legal scholarship, and particularly in Germany in the last couple of years, also on commentaries and the production of commentaries. For Switzerland, we have some indications. One of the most famous studies possibly was the analysis of appeals of asylum claims in the Swiss federal courts, which was data that was gathered first by the Tagesanzeiger and then analyzed by colleagues in Zurich. And they find that there are significant differences among the level or the rate of allowing appeals or rejecting appeals if you sort people by their political party affiliation. So Hangartner and colleagues who write the academic part of the study say that there's a persistent inconsistency rate of about 5%, and that judges' estimated preference are correlated with party membership in expected ways. So if you are related or affiliated with a more conservative party, you're more likely to reject more asylum appeals. So this question then, are judges human? What is the subjectivity of legal practice? Is of course not new. In a way, you could thus argue is what's happening now in this field is providing old news with new or better data. Because the question, are judges human, is something that was already discussed in the 1930s. And the subjectivity of legal practice was, for example, also recognized in the Conference of German Jurists in 1912, where Eugen Ehrlich, one of the founders of the sociology of law, was asked to give insights into how legal practitioners can be less biased. I want to go beyond that, or suggest that the research now is and should be going beyond the debate over legal formalism versus legal realism, though. So while this critique of legal doctrine or the contextualization of legal doctrine is not new, And we have a fantastic classical text like that on transcendental nonsense, which is supposed to be legal doctrines by Felix Cohen. I would argue that what is necessary and what the sociological approach to the legal profession can bring is a more reflexive approach to legal doctrine that can acknowledge the function of the ideal of legal doctrine and aim to reduce the bias. So you don't say, oh, legal doctrine is subjective, so it's worthless. You can say it's important, and yet there is bias, but there might be ways to recognize the bias and to reduce the bias. Rüdiger Lautmann, a German lawyer and sociologist who made big waves with his studies of the irrationality of judges in the 1970s, also has come around to these ideas, and he says that the idea of an independent judiciary, of an objective and neutral and kind of idealized judiciary is important because it is feared by all dictators. So even if people are human, and even if law is an institution of people with people, it is important to recognize the function, the importance of this idea as something that is feared in non-democratic situations, but also something that is creating trust in institutions in democratic societies. So the question then is, and I want to conclude here, is can we have a more reflexive turn in legal practice? One that values the idea of legal doctrine and recognizes that it is an idea and not the reality or not fact. That can recognize the subjectivity of legal practice and aim to reduce bias and irrationality, aim to improve on that subjectivity, if you want. I'm calling this a reflexive term because it mirrors what we call the reflexive term in post-positivist sociology and anthropology with authors like Giddens, Bourdieu, and Margaret Archer, or Clifford and Marcus and Rosaldo in anthropology, arguing that we can achieve better methods and better interpretation by being more aware of the limits of both methods and interpretation, and by trying to reflexively increase our capacity to use methods and to interpret data. I want to stop here and thank you for listening, and I look forward to the discussion. Professor Baldorf wants to give you some instructions on how to choice.
Well, thank you, Mr. Eule. Thank you also for listening to this presentation. I'd like you now to switch to Zoom because we will have another 30 minutes available for questions and answers. And in order to be able to do this interactively, we need to change to Zoom. So we will close YouTube, and you will all have a link for the Zoom meeting. And I'd like you to change to that. And we'll see each other in a few minutes. Okay, thank you.